This is chapter 24 on the urinary system. The chapters on the fun will be chapter 23, the digestive system, this chapter 24 on the urinary system, and then chapter 25 on the reproductive system. Some of the functions of the kidneys includes balancing chemicals, balancing ions. It can control how much is going to be lost in the urine, how many ions will be lost, if we need to retain some of those ions, if we need to get rid of some of those ions. So that's what it means by maintain the chemical consistency of blood, maintaining the amount of, say, sodium or potassium, so on and so forth. And then also there's water balance. So the kidney is used for water balance. There's a delicate level of water that needs to stay in the tissues. So if we have too much water in our tissues, it increases our blood pressure or our blood volume. So then we can get rid of excess water through our kidneys into our urine. Or if we get dehydrated, it lowers our blood pressure and lowers our blood volume, so we can retain more water from the urine or from the filtrate that will become urine, and then your blood pressure will go back up. All right, along with the fluid that is filtered out, toxins that can dissolve in the filtrate will be eliminated. We can eliminate some metabolic waste like urea and uric acid. Urea and uric acid are byproducts of protein metabolism, and then creatinine, which is a byproduct of also protein metabolism and nucleic acid metabolism. All right, these are the main organs of the urinary system. We'll go over each one. We have the kidneys first. Those are the main organs of the urinary system. Your entire blood supply is going to go through both of your kidneys. You have two. You have one on the right, one on the left, and it filters out waste. It filters out excess ions and excess water, and can retain ions if we need to and retain some water. It definitely will do that. And then the tubes that lead to the bladder are called the ureters. So you have two ureters, one for the right, one for the left kidney. And then we have the bladder. The urinary bladder sits in the floor of the pelvic floor muscles, and it's for the temporary storage of urine. And then the tube that goes from the bladder to the outside is called the urethra. So don't mix up the terms ureter and urethra, because they are two different tubes going in different directions. In this picture, we can see where the kidneys are. The kidneys sit on the posterior abdominal wall. You have one on the right, one on the left. The one that's on the right is lower than the one on the left, and that makes sense because right above the right kidney is going to be the gigantic liver. So the liver is pushing that kidney down a little bit. You'll see that on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. They are pyramid-shaped glands. We talked about the adrenal glands in the endocrine system. There's the adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla, so on and so forth. We have the blood supply going into the kidneys, the renal artery coming in, renal vein coming out. And then here is the ureter, which is the tube that goes from the kidney all the way down to the bladder. And here's the bladder. What they're not showing really is the urethra, which would be this tube right here. So all your blood will go in through your renal arteries, and they'll find structures called nephrons inside of the kidney. We'll go over the anatomy of a nephron eventually. And then all the blood leaves through the renal vein. I do want to note at this time, though, I forgot to mention, is this part of the kidney, which is called the hilum. The hilum of the kidney is where blood vessels enter and exit, and it's where the ureter comes out right here. All right, so this slide talks about some of the same things I just mentioned with the kidneys. You have two of them, one on the right, one on the left. They're about around T12 to L3 when it comes to where they are in relation to the spine. They are retroperitoneal, which means they're behind the parietal peritoneum. And I mentioned that a little bit in the digestion lecture, that the peritoneal membranes are the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum is actually on the surface of the abdominal organs, and then the parietal peritoneum is on the wall of the abdominal cavity. Well, there are some organs that are behind the parietal peritoneum. They call that retroperitoneal. And here's where they mention the hilum. The hilum is on the medial side of the kidney, and that's where blood vessels enter and exit. That's where the renal artery goes in. The renal vein comes out. That's where the ureters come out, and that's where the nerves enter and exit through the kidneys. Are the tissues that surround the kidney. We'll start with the one that's closest to the kidney, and then we'll work our way out. The connective tissue that's immediately around the kidney is called a fibrous capsule, or just a capsule. And this capsule is dense connective tissue and helps inhibit the spread of infection. That means as your blood goes through your kidneys, some of that it's carrying pathogens, and those pathogens can create an infection and you can get a kidney infection. Well, we don't want that infection to spread to the tissues that are surrounding the kidney. So those infectious organisms cannot pass through the capsule. And the same thing if the tissues around the kidney are infected, they can't infect the inside of the kidney without going in through the blood supply. So it prevents the spread of infection either into the kidney or out from the kidney. And then around the fibrous capsule is a layer of fat called the perirenal fat capsule. And then outside of that is another layer of connective tissue called the renal fascia. And then on the outside of that is another layer of fat called the pararenal fat. So the deepest layer is the fibrous capsule, which is surrounded by a fat layer called the perirenal fat capsule. And then that is surrounded by another dense irregular connective tissue known as renal fascia. And then there's another layer of fat around that called the pararenal fat. This picture is showing you the retroperitoneal position of the kidneys. Here's the kidney, and then here's the parietal peritoneum, all right here. So the kidneys are definitely behind that, so that's why they are called retroperitoneal. This is a good picture to show you where the kidneys are located in relative position next to the rib cage. Some of the ribs will protect some of the kidneys, but it is possible for there still to be some damage to the kidneys if it goes between the ribs. Before we go to the picture showing the inside of the kidney, let's go through some definitions. Whenever you cut through the kidney through a frontal section, which means you separate the front half from the back half, the kidney is separated into a renal cortex and a renal medulla. The renal cortex is the outer region of the kidney and is full of nephrons called cortical nephrons. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and we'll go over the anatomy of the nephron later. But the renal cortex is the outer part. Underneath the renal cortex, deep to it, is the renal medulla. And the structure that's in the renal medulla looks like a pyramid, and it's called the renal pyramids. So the renal pyramids are part of the renal medulla. And then we have the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis leads to the ureter, which is going to then go down to the bladder. But what's inside of the kidney is called the renal pelvis. There are funnels that lead to the renal pelvis, and the funnels are either small or they're large. If it is a small funnel, it's called a minor calyx or a minor calyces, which is plural. If it was just calyx as singular, it would be Calyx, which is just one of them. And you'll see what I'm talking about on the picture. So the minor calyx is close to the renal pyramid. Then we have larger funnels, which are the major calyces. Now again, just one of them is a major calyx, but altogether they're called the major calyces. So the renal pyramids lead to a minor calyx, and the minor calyx leads to a major calyx, and then the major calyx leads to the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis leads to the ureter. Now this slide's talking about the vasculature of the kidneys, and we're going to go over that in depth in a different slide. But the renal arteries, the renal artery that enters into the kidney becomes a segmental artery. The segmental artery becomes an interlobar artery, and then the interlobar artery leads to an arcuate artery, and then from there it leads to something called an interlobular artery, and then or also known as the cortical radiate arteries. Eventually, we're going to go through the entire pathway of the flow of blood, starting with the abdominal aorta and ending with the inferior vena cava. All right, let's go through some of these parts. So the renal cortex, I have the red dot now. The renal cortex is all of this that's in the outer part of the kidney. All of this around here is renal cortex. These triangular shaped structures, that's part of the renal medulla, and this is specifically called a renal pyramid. The renal pyramid has a base, which is close to or adjacent to the cortex, and then we have the renal papilla, which is right here. The renal papilla comes to a point and an apex and then empties into a minor calyx. So right here's a minor funnel, the minor calyx. Here's the renal papilla. The whole thing is the renal pyramid. All right, so the cortex, the outer part. On the very outside of the kidney, though, is going to be the capsule. So here's the renal capsule. If we go right below it, that's the renal cortex. Then we go below that, right here's the renal pyramid. And then below that, right here is the renal papilla. And then below that, right here is the minor calyx. I want to note that the cortex dips down in between each renal pyramid, like right here, and right here, and right here. That's called a renal column. So a renal column is a part of the cortex that dips down into the medulla and separates the renal pyramids. So we have cortex, and then here's the column right here. The sections where we have a renal pyramid and the cortex above it, this is called a lobe of the kidney. So here's one lobe of the kidney. Here's another lobe of the kidney. Here's another lobe. Maybe I should draw a line on it so that you can understand what I'm talking about. All right, so here is one lobe. That would be another lobe. Another lobe. So those are the renal lobes. And the reason why I want to point that out now is because when we start talking about the blood supply through the kidney, there's going to be one artery and vein or vessels that go right here in between the lobes. And those vessels that go between the lobes are called interlobar vessels. Okay, so we did the lobes. So here's the column again. Here's the renal pyramid. And then here's the renal papilla, where it comes to an apex. And here's the minor calyx. The minor calyces, which are all right here, they all come together to form the major calyx. So here's the minor calyx above it. So here's the major calyx. Right here would be a major calyx, and right here. And then they come together in the renal pelvis, which is going to be right here. Renal pelvis exits at the hilum and becomes the ureter, which is going to be right here. Let's follow the pathway of the flow of blood through the kidney. We're going to start with the abdominal aorta and end with the inferior vena cava. If you haven't reviewed the chapter yet or gone through it, some of this is going to sound real foreign to you. So I just would recommend maybe looking at it first, especially the next slide where it spells it out, and just have it in front of you as I go through this. So you don't have to worry about spelling these correctly or having to look it up real quick. So the abdominal aorta has a branch off of it called the renal artery. So we're going to start with the light with the renal artery, which is right here. As soon as that renal artery enters through the kidney, it becomes the segmental artery. And then the segmental artery curves up and it goes in between the lobes. So right here it becomes the interlobar artery. So the interlobar artery goes through the column, and then it curves around the base of the pyramid. This part where it curves is called the arcuate artery. And then the arcuate artery goes into the cortex, and it becomes an interlobular artery. Now there's another term for this interlobular artery. It's also known as the cortical radiate artery, either way. And then from the cortical radiate artery, there's a small artery off of that called the afferent arteriole. And then I'm going to have to stop using the light for a second because we can't see those microscopic structures yet, but we'll see that later in another picture. So the afferent arteriole leads to a capillary bed called a glomerulus. And the glomerulus is inside the renal corpuscle, which is inside of the nephron. The blood vessel that leaves the nephron is called the efferent arteriole, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Efferent arteriole. Now the efferent arteriole leads to a second capillary bed. It could either be the peritubular capillaries or the vasorecta capillaries, depending on where it is. If it's in the cortex, it's peritubular capillaries. If it's in the renal medulla, then it's the vasorecta. So now we have delivered the filtrate through the kidney, and we've delivered the oxygen to the tissues. Now we're going to return the blood. It's going to be oxygen-poor blood. So it starts going back from the vasorecta into the interlobular or cortical radiate vein, which is going to be in the cortex. And then it goes into the arcuate vein right here. And then the arcuate vein leads to the interlobar vein, which is also in the column next to the interlobar artery. And then the interlobar vein, I should come over here, interlobar vein goes directly to the renal vein. There is no segmental vein. There's just a segmental artery. All right, so we went from interlobar vein to renal vein, and then the renal vein empties directly into this inferior vena cava. Now this is all spelled out on the next page. So we start with the abdominal aorta, which leads to the renal artery, which leads to the segmental artery. Segmental artery goes into the renal column and becomes the interlobar artery. The interlobar artery, when it reaches the cortex, it arcs over the base of the pyramid to the arcuate artery. And then the arcuate artery leads to the interlobular artery, or also known as the cortical radiate artery. After the cortical radiate artery, we have the arterioles. It starts with the afferent arteriole, which leads to the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is actually inside of the nephron. And then the blood leaving the nephron leads to the efferent arteriole, which then leads to the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta, depending on whether it's in the cortex or in the medulla. So then the peritubular capillaries lead to the cortical radiate vein, also known as the interlobular vein, which then leads to the arcuate vein. Arcuate vein leads to the interlobar vein. Interlobar vein leads to the renal vein, which then leads to the inferior vena cava. And that is the flow of blood through the kidney, starting with the aorta and ending with the inferior vena cava. All right, I mentioned it before. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. The functional unit means it is the smallest thing or smallest unit that's doing the work for this organ. For example, the sarcomere was the function unit of skeletal muscle. The function unit of the nervous system was the neuron, so on and so forth. So the nephron is the function unit of the kidney. Each kidney has a little more than 1 million nephrons, so you have a little more than 2 million nephrons between the two kidneys. And as you are perfectly capable of surviving on just one kidney, as you may already know. There are 3 processes or mechanisms that make or produce urine. First, there's something called filtration. Filtration occurs at the nephron, at the renal corpuscle. Filtration is how the filtrate, which is your plasma, leaves the capillaries and is caught by the nephron. So the filtrate is the fluid part of blood that leaves in the first part of the nephron. Then we have resorption. We're going to filter out about 180 liters per day of fluid. We're going to reclaim 179 or 178.5 of those liters back. How do we reclaim it? The process is called resorption. So resorption is taking back water or nutrients or any type of essential ions that we want to reclaim and keep from the filtrate. And then we have secretion. Secretion only involves molecules or ions. And we're going to take these molecules or ions and put them directly into the tubule without going through the glomerulus. And secretion applies to hydrogen ion or potassium ion. Those are the typical ions that are removed from the blood using secretion. This is kind of a dumbed down or basic picture of a nephron. We have the blood supply coming in to the nephron and going back out. This would be the afferent arteriole leading to the glomerulus. From the glomerulus, we're going to lose the filtrate, and that process is called filtration. So filtration, moving filtrate from the cardiovascular system and into the nephron. That is filtration. And then as it goes to the next part of the nephron, which is a tubule, some of that we're going to reclaim, called resorption. So we're going from the tubule into the circulation. And then some ions we're going to put directly from the circulation directly into the nephron, and that would be secretion. So here's filtration, moving fluid out of the glomerulus. Here's resorption, moving fluid and ions from the nephron back into the cardiovascular system. Or secretion, moving substances from the cardiovascular system into the nephron tubule. There are 2 main parts of a nephron. We have a renal corpuscle, which we're going to go over first, and then a renal tubule. The renal corpuscle is the part of the nephron that contains the glomerular capillaries, where we start losing the filtrate. After the renal corpuscle is the renal tubule, and that has names like the distal convoluted tubule, proximal convoluted tubule, and the nephron loop, stuff like that. So let's start with the renal corpuscle. There are 2 parts to the renal corpuscle. There's the glomerulus, which is a tuft or a ball of capillaries, and then we have the glomerular capsule, also known as Bowman's capsule. Together, collectively, they are called the renal corpuscle. All right, so the glomerulus is a ball of capillaries. These are fenestrated capillaries. If you remember that from the chapter on blood vessels, fenestrated capillaries had intracellular clefts, and they also had holes in the cells, which are the fenestrations. And we found fenestrated capillaries in areas where there's a high rate of exchange, like the kidneys and the small intestine. All right, so the glomerulus is inside of the Bowman's capsule. Now, if you remember, there's an arteriole that goes into the renal corpuscle to become the glomerulus. So the afferent arteriole enters the renal corpuscle to become the glomerulus. Then the blood vessel leaving the glomerulus is the efferent arteriole as it leaves the renal corpuscle. Now the cap around the glomerulus is called the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. Now Bowman's capsule has two layers to it. There's a parietal layer, which means it's on the outside layer, and it is a simple squamous epithelium. And then there's a visceral layer to Bowman's capsule, which is made of cells called podocytes. The podocytes surround the glomerulus and the fenestrations. They help keep proteins in the circulation because you don't want to lose proteins to your urine. That would be a problem, and it usually indicates kidney disease. So glomerular Bowman's capsule has two layers to it, a parietal layer and a visceral layer. There's a membrane that all fluid must pass through in order to get from the glomerulus and into the renal nephron. That membrane is called the filtration membrane. If you remember back to the respiratory system, we had a respiratory membrane that gases must cross through in order to get into the pulmonary capillary or out into the alveolus, the air sac. So with the kidneys, it's called the filtration membrane, and there are three layers to the filtration membrane. First, we have the capillary endothelium. This is talking about the glomerular capillary endothelium, and so that's why they say it's the fenestrated. So the endothelium of the glomerular capillary is one layer. There's a basement membrane in the middle, and then the third membrane are these little slits called filtration slits, and they are between the foot processes of the podocytes. A podo or POD means foot, cyte means cell. So these are cells with feet, and they interdigitate, which means they alternate back and forth, and they create slits called filtration slits. So the three parts, we have the fenestrated capillary endothelium of the glomerulus, the basement membrane, and then the filtration slits of the podocytes. This slide is showing you the renal corpuscle. So we have the glomerulus, which is the ball capillaries inside here. The yellow cells that surround them, these are the podocytes. And on the next page, we'll be able to see a closer picture of the filtration slits of the podocytes. So the afferent arteriole is right here, is bringing blood into the glomerulus. It goes through here, loses the filtrate, and then it exits through the efferent arteriole. You'll notice that the circumference of the afferent arteriole is larger than the circumference of the efferent arteriole. And that is because we lose filtrate. So there's not as much leaving the glomerulus as there was going in. So it makes sense that's going to be a little smaller. Now here's Bowman's capsule. Right here, here's the parietal layer of Bowman's capsule. It's the simple squamous epithelium in the end. And then these filtration slits would be the visceral layer of the filtration membrane. And then this space right here, the space between the podocytes, the visceral layer, and the parietal layer, this is called the glomerular capsular space. And this is going to be filled with fluid. This fluid is coming from the glomerulus. So this is the fluid that has gone through the filtration membrane. It fills up this space right here before it goes down into the next part of the nephron, which is called the renal tubule. All right, so this is showing you a closer picture of the foot processes of the podocytes right here. Right here we have the interdigitating parts of the podocytes, and they create a slit called the filtration slit. And this is showing you the filtration membrane. So here is the lumen of the capillary. Over here is going to be the lumen of the Bowman's capsule. So we have blood coming in through here. The plasma filters through the fenestrations, and then it goes through the filtration slits before it goes into the capsular space. So this, collectively, all three of these together, that is the filtration membrane. All right, the second part of the nephron is called the renal tubule, and the tubule is exactly what it sounds like, a tiny tube. The first part of the renal tubule is called the proximal convoluted tubule, and we'll see pictures here in just a minute. But proximal because it is closest to the renal corpuscle, convoluted because it's not a straight tube, it twists and turns. So first we have the proximal convoluted tubule, which then leads to the nephron loop. The nephron loop has different parts to it. First, there's a descending limb. We're not going to worry about the terms thin limb or a thick limb, so I'm going to cross that out. We're not going to worry about descending thin limb or ascending thin limb. All right, so we have the descending limb, which then leads to something called the loop of Henle. After the loop of Henle, we have the ascending limb, and then the ascending limb leads to a distal convoluted tubule. Distal because it's further away from the renal corpuscle, convoluted because it is not a straight tube, it has many twists and turns to it. And then the distal convoluted tubule leads to a collecting duct. The collecting duct is not considered to be part of the nephron, although some books might go ahead and include it. Multiple distal convoluted tubules lead to the same collecting duct. So let's talk about the collecting duct. And actually, we can also include the distal convoluted tubule with this. However, they're not both in the same slide. All right, so like I said earlier, there are several distal convoluted tubules that lead to the same collecting duct. But the collecting duct plays an important role in conserving your body fluids. There is a hormone called ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. It's also known as vasopressin, and it comes from the posterior pituitary. If you remember from the endocrine chapter, this is the hormone that makes you retain more water. You retain more water by opening water channels, so the filtrate that's traveling through the renal tubule will leave the renal tubule and go into the tissues to be collected by the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. So, in other words, the ADH hormone or vasopressin increases permeability of water in the collecting ducts in the distal convoluted tubules, so they open up more water channels. The more antidiuretic hormone released, the more water channels that will open and the more concentrated your urine will be because you're retaining more water. And that's a lot of physiology that we'll go over at this time of the year in next semester, if you're in my class. All right, let's follow the light. And we're going to start with the renal corpuscle. So all this filtrate that's collected into the capsular space goes into the proximal convoluted tubule. So here's the proximal convoluted tubule, right here, as it goes through. And then it dips down into the descending limb of the nephron loop, which leads to the loop of Henle. And then it goes to the ascending limb of the nephron loop, ascending, ascending, ascending. And then we have the distal convoluted tubule, distal because it's further away from the renal corpuscle. And then it leads to the collecting duct, which then goes all the way down and empties into the minor calyx. You'll see here that there are multiple distal convoluted tubules that lead to the same collecting duct. There are two types of nephrons based on their location. Most of them are cortical nephrons. These cortical nephrons are mainly in the cortex. The other 15% are juxtamedullary nephrons, and they dip down into the medulla, into the renal pyramids. All right, so in this picture, we're seeing the cortical nephron on this side. Right here is the juxtamedullary nephron. So if we go through the cortical nephron, right here, we have blood coming into the afferent arteriole, and it goes into the glomerulus, and we lose the filtrate into the proximal convoluted tubule. And then we have the descending limb of the nephron loop, ascending limb of the nephron loop. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule then leads to the collecting duct. Now, if you look at the juxtaglomerular, we have blood coming in again through the afferent arteriole. Filtrate leaves to the proximal convoluted tubule, which is right here. We follow that all the way around. All the way around the nephron loop. Here's the descending limb. Here's the loop of Henle, and then the ascending limb. And then the ascending limb leads to the distal convoluted tubule, which then leads to the collecting duct. Now there might be questions, or I used to ask questions like this. There might be some questions on the test, I'll have to look for them. What's attached to what? The descending limb is attached to the proximal convoluted tubule. The ascending limb is attached to the distal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule is attached to Bowman's capsule, so on and so forth. And which tubule leads to the collecting duct? That would be the distal convoluted tubule. All right, the names of the capillary beds. We have glomerulus. We went over that earlier. The glomerulus is inside the renal corpuscle. The blood vessel that leads to the glomerulus is the afferent arteriole, and then the blood vessel leaving the glomerulus would be the efferent arteriole. And then we have peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries are in the cortex. So they're going to surround the cortical nephrons, or they're going to surround the proximal and the distal convoluted tubules of the juxtamedullary nephrons. And then we have vasa recta. Vasa recta are going to surround the nephron loop of the juxtamedullary nephrons. I'm going to skip the next few slides because I've already mentioned this, but go through there and highlight the different parts that I have already mentioned. All right, a part of the nephron or around the nephron is a complex called the juxtaglomerular complex, and this helps regulate blood pressure. It'll help raise the blood pressure or blood volume if it gets too low by secreting a hormone called renin. Renin starts a whole process called the renin-angiotensin system, where it causes vasoconstriction and the release of aldosterone, all in order to raise your blood pressure or your blood volume. So we're not going to get into too many details other than the anatomy of the juxtaglomerular apparatus or the juxtaglomerular complex. I'm going to go to a picture. So in this picture, I'm going to circle it with the dot. Right here is the juxtaglomerular complex, right here. It involves some of the cells that surround or are on the outside of the afferent arteriole, some of the cells on the outside part of the efferent arteriole. These cells right here are called the juxtaglomerular cells. Now where the afferent arteriole goes in and the efferent arteriole comes out, we have a section of the distal convoluted tubule that passes right by them. The cells that are located right here are called the macula densa cells. And the macula densa cells will measure the sodium chloride levels of the filtrate as it passes through the tubule. And I'm not going to get into too many details than that, but however, it will trigger the release of renin to help raise your blood pressure or blood volume, or it could cause vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole to limit how much blood's going to the glomerulus if there's too much filtrate being passed through the glomerulus. But anyway, that's what it is in a nutshell. We have juxtaglomerular cells between the afferent and efferent arteriole and the macula densa cells of the distal convoluted tubule, where they all come together at the juxtaglomerular complex. All right, so now we're done with the kidneys. Let's talk about the tubes that lead to the bladder. These tubes that lead to the bladder are called the ureters. Some people pronounce them ureters. Either way, I prefer ureters. So ureters transports urine from the kidneys to the bladder. Now, once the filtrate passes through the collecting duct and it enters into the minor calyx, it's no longer called filtrate. Now it is urine. We can no longer claim anything and get it back from anything once it passes through the collecting duct. That's it. There's no more getting any fluid back, there's no more getting any ions back, and there's no more putting any ions directly into the filtrate anymore. So, ureters carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The main tissue layers of the ureter, it is lined on the inside with a transitional epithelium. We talked about the different tissue types way back in chapter 4. And one of the epithelial tissues, which was a stratified tissue, is transitional epithelium. And the only locations we talked about transitional epithelium had to do with the urinary system. So the transitional epithelium lines the ureters, and it also lines the bladder. The reason why it's called transitional epithelium is because it starts in a square-shaped, like cuboidal-shaped cell, maybe even columnar-shaped cell, But then as it fills with urine, it flattens out. It transitions to a flatter shape. So that's why it's called transitional epithelium. And then we have muscles of the ureters. Just like in the alimentary canal, there's an inner layer and an outer layer. But this time the inner layer is longitudinal and the outer layer is a circular layer, which helps make valves and sphincters. These muscles can do peristalsis just like the muscles of the alimentary canal. Now typically, since we're mostly upright or even when we're laying down, gravity will take care of urine traveling down to the bladder. However, you can stand on your head and still have still have urine make it to your bladder because of the peristalsis. You are definitely aware of the peristalsis if you've ever had a kidney stone. I've had 6. But anyway, when you have a kidney stone, which is a spiny, like a porcupine, little stone in your kidney, and this gets dislodged and it goes down the ureter, and then every time the muscles contract of the ureter, you feel a sharp pain. And the peristalsis happens in waves, and you can feel it come and go. So the pain pattern for urinary stones varies. It could start in the upper back, it could start in the groin, it just depends. Anyway, so we have muscles that do peristalsis. The outer part of the ureter is an adventitia. We talked about adventitia in the digestive system. If it's an adventitia, then it's going to encroach into the tissues that surround it. So it's important that the ureters have adventitia on the outside of them so that they can make sure they don't flop around too much inside the abdomen and the pelvis. And now we have the bladder. The bladder is a sac, and it can expand as it fills with urine. It's a temporary storage or holding place for the urine until you can get to a place where you can let it go. A healthy bladder can hold up to about 2 cups of urine comfortably, and then at night you can hold up to 4 to 6 cups of urine before you get up. But anyway, the amount that you can hold maximum before it bursts is going to vary, so I'm not even going to get into that. A couple of differences between the position of the bladder between males and females. With males, there is a gland underneath the bladder called the prostate. Females do not have a prostate. Males have a prostate, and the urethra has to go through the prostate. But if there's a problem with the prostate, if it becomes inflamed or infected, it's going to close off the urethra and you're unable to urinate. With females, they have a uterus that lays on top of the bladder. So with pregnant females, as the uterus grows with the fetus inside of it, it pushes and applies pressure to the bladder, and it makes them feel like they have to go to the bathroom a lot more than they really need to. All right, here's the male and female pelvis. Here's the bladder in the male pelvis, and you can see right here is the prostate right underneath it. And then the female bladder is right here, and you see the uterus right above it, right up here. Here's the female bladder. Might as well talk about the urethra since it's right here. But there's the urethra is the tube that leads from the bladder to the outside. So here's the female urethra right here. It's a lot shorter than the male urethra. The male urethra, as it leaves the bladder, goes through the prostate, then it goes through the pelvic floor muscles, and it goes through the penis, all the way before it gets to the outside. So the tissues of the bladder include a mucosa, which is going to be a transitional epithelium. The muscle of the bladder is called detrusor. So detrusor is the muscle of the bladder, and then the outside of the bladder is an adventitia, especially that part of the bladder that sits on the floor of the pelvic floor muscles. The top part of the bladder is not an adventitia so much as it is a serosa, but most of it is going to be an adventitia so that the bladder doesn't roll around inside of the pelvis. Inside of the bladder is a triangular area called the trigone. Right here's the trigone. Looks like a triangle because it is marked by 3 openings into the bladder. You have 2 openings up here for the ureters that are coming down from both kidneys, and then you have this opening exiting the bladder through the urethra. So this area is called the trigone of the bladder. Since this picture is not later, let's go ahead and go through the parts of the male urethra. The male urethra has 3 named parts. There's this part right here that goes through the prostate. This is the prostatic urethra. And then there's this part of the urethra through the pelvic floor muscles. This is called the membranous urethra. And then we have this part of the urethra that goes through the penis. There's two different names for it. It's either called the penile urethra or the spongy urethra. The reason why it's called the spongy urethra, because there are two types of erectile tissues in the penis, and we'll talk about this in the reproductive system. There's corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. Corpus spongiosum is the tube of erectile tissue that the urethra goes through, which is why this is called the spongy urethra. So again, we have the prostatic urethra, membranous urethra, and then the penile spongy urethra before it exits through the urethral orifice. Now, when it comes to sphincters associated with the urethra, there's two sphincters. There's the internal urethral sphincter and there's the external urethral sphincter. The internal urethral sphincter is right here. It's located between the bladder and the prostatic urethra. The external urethral sphincter is right here in the pelvic floor muscles. The internal sphincter is involuntary. As urine floods into the bladder, as it expands, it sends the signal to the brain eventually that you have to go to the bathroom. So once that happens, once there's enough fluid inside of the bladder, the internal urethral sphincter automatically opens. So now urine is free to flow through the urethra. And now we have the external urethral sphincter, which is voluntary. So you can hold it until you get to the bathroom, or if you're males, until you can get outside, whatever floats your boat. Anyway, so this is the external urethral sphincter. As we get older, sometimes there is a failure in this external urethral sphincter, which is why we cannot control our bladder. Female, same thing. Here's the trigone. Here's the opening to the ureter on this side, opening to the ureter on that side. Right here's the opening to the urethra. And again, you also have internal and external urethral sphincters. The internal urethral sphincter is right here between the bladder and the urethra. And then right here, right next to it, that's where we have the opening to the outside, actually. And this is where the pelvic floor muscles are. So this is the external urethral sphincter. Now the tissues of the urethra. The part of the urethra that's closest to the bladder is transitional epithelium, just like it is inside of the ureter and inside of the bladder. But then as we move through either the penis or even towards the end of the urethra in females, it changes to a stratified squamous epithelium, because any opening to the outside is lined with a stratified squamous epithelium. All right, and I mentioned this earlier. Let's just go ahead and highlight it. There's an internal urethral sphincter and external urethral sphincter. The internal is involuntary. It stays closed until there's enough urine inside of the bladder to make it open. Once that does, then the brain lets you know you got to go. And then you have the external urethral sphincter, which is voluntary. On a side note, I just want to stress that the autonomic nervous system that's in control of the urethral sphincters. The parasympathetic nervous system has to be in control in order to relax the external urethral sphincter. If you are stressed or in the sympathetic nervous system mode, it's very, very hard or very, very difficult, I should say, to void your bladder. Here's where we mentioned the three parts of the male urethra. The prostatic urethra goes to the prostate. They call it the intermediate part of the urethra, but it's also known as the membranous urethra. And then we have the spongy penile urethra. Let's go ahead and make a note of this. The intermediate part of the urethra, if they ask a question about that on the exam, you're not going to see membranous urethra on the exam. You're going to see intermediate part of the urethra, so I just want to point that out. And then the spongy penile urethra. The term micturition means urination, basically. And what happens is that urine fills into the bladder. Once it stretches to a certain point, stretch receptors send a signal, sends a signal into the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord is going to send a signal up to the pons, which then sends a signal back to the bladder and opens the internal urethral sphincter. And then you have under your control, voluntary control, the external urethral sphincter. That's all I have for you for chapter 24. So if you have any questions, email me.